online, welcome our online guests as well. Hopefully everyone, yes, we are recording this meeting. And if you have any questions for the online people, if you just want to pop them into the chat or you're having any difficulty in terms of sound or vision, that would be great as well. So welcome to you today. I'd just like to get started by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land, the Yugambeh people, and acknowledge their elders past, present and emerging. And I'd also like to welcome our special guest today, Sam Palmer, who's joining us here on the Gold Coast for a couple of days with the Institute for Tourism. Sam is also on our advisory board for the Institute, and we really value your contribution to the advisory board. Sam is also the General Manager of the Visitor Economy team, which are heading up the Thrive 2030 strategy and also client programs. She also does quite a lot of work in terms of diversity and inclusion, and she's a champion for that at Austrade. So great contribution, Sam. We have a few people that are part of the Institute that work in that space as well. So really great to see that. Sam brings over 30 years of experience across many senior executive roles in government, including leading policies and programs and corporate transformation in the Queensland, Western Australia and Commonwealth governments. And so she brings lots of experience. She's very much involved in the tourism industry in Australia. And also I do enjoy following, we just were talking about your social media, because she's always got an eye on the ball in terms of what's happening both in Australia and internationally in terms of tourism. So if you haven't already, please follow Sam on LinkedIn and the other social media platforms, because she's really active in that space. So I might leave it there and hand over to Sam for her presentation today. Thanks so much, Sam.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you so much to Griffith Institute for Tourism for inviting me to make this presentation. I watch your work with real, it's a real privilege to be part of it actually on the advisory panel, and also to see the great work that the students, the higher students are doing and the research that you do. You should be very proud of your place in the world in terms of the work that you do. So it's a privilege to be here. Can I add my acknowledgement to Sarah's for the Yugambeh people in this region, and also to acknowledge and welcome Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people joining us in this seminar, and also acknowledge the lands upon which you are for those joining us from virtually. And on the screen, I've got a quote that's in Thrive, part of what is quite an extensive acknowledgement of country. And it's worth reminding us what Dean Sanders says, which is that due to the care and custodianship of these lands in Australia over many, many generations and thousands of years, that in fact all tourism that occurs here is Indigenous tourism, and we should be respecting and acknowledging that. So today I'm going to cover what we do in Austrade, regional tourism and its importance in the bigger picture, Thrive 2030 and the targets we have, progress, forecasts, and some ideas about achieving the long-term regional targets, which are in fact probably our most challenging in this area. So there are two government agencies or government-funded agencies that work in the tourism landscape that you'd be very familiar with. The first is Tourism Australia, which is our national marketing organisation funded by government, but run as a separate, more commercial agency with a separate board. And their responsibility is to drive demand into Australia. And everyone, of course, is very familiar with their incredibly important and valuable work. The work that the Australian Trade and Investment Commission does, or Austrade, in the tourism space is perhaps a little more opaque. And so worth pointing out that we are responsible for the supply side. So we have the national policy responsibilities. So at present, that's articulated in Thrive 2030. And we also work very hard to influence all the different parts of policy across government, where it's not a specific tourism policy, but it's very relevant to tourism. So aviation is an example. So we work very much across more than 20 government agencies in the Commonwealth. We produce data and insights from Tourism Research Australia, which is a specific part of a branch in my division and reports through to me. We manage a wide range of grant programs that each different government has over time to really support supply side development and capability and a range of other things. And they're always very interesting and bring us very close to tourism businesses. And the agency itself is responsible for promoting Australia as a study destination. So in that's part of our trade activity. And so we work in my division very closely with the trade team that do international education marketing on behalf of and for instance, the universities in partnership with the education department. So let's go to Thrive 2030. You'll be familiar with the strategy, hopefully issued in March 2022, updated and reissued when the new government came in and had its priorities to add and actions to add to the document. And every time we update, we change the cover to try to help make it easier to work out which version you're looking at, and note that in the inside cover if you've ever wondered. And we're currently in the development and delivery of phase 1, which is our recovery phase. We have 3 phases through to 2030. And of course, we've got to work on phase 2 soon. We're working toward that this year. So the vision for Thrive 2030 is for our visitor economy to provide world-leading services and visitor experiences to consumers, while also delivering significant and sustainable benefits to the Australian community. And we do this in 3 ways: by collaborating, by modernising, and by diversifying. And they're really the core basis of everything that you see us trying to do. And we set some targets. We set spend targets quite some time ago now when you think about it, and we're going to talk about those targets in a little bit more detail, but it's very important to note that of those targets that we've set, that we're trying to really make sure that there are strong benefits into regional Australia, with 40% of the target spend set there. So Thrive has some priorities. We broke them into 7 policy areas around collaboration, data and insights improvement, workforce, which is a perennial challenge and has been for decades, embracing world leading edge business practices in how we do what we do, visitor infrastructure enhancement, building markets, attracting visitors, and growing unique and high quality products, including First Nations. So the first phase has 64 strategic actions, 10 have been completed, 51 are underway, and 3 are pending. So that's a quick snapshot. What I wanted to do is draw your attention to a diagram which is in Thrive 2030, which just explains the size and scope of the visitor economy. So when we talk about it, this is what we mean. It was worth $166 billion up to the end of December 2019, the comparison point which we've all had and we had at that point. It's split into international spend and domestic. So $107 billion of that 166 was spent by domestic markets. So VFL markets, business markets, so it's 26 billion by business travellers, holiday at 53 billion. And then international is a really interesting combination, and here's where it's important. We talk about the change to the methodology in this strategy compared to Tourism 2020. So up the top, the 2 biggest green bars you can see there are education. So under international standards, a visitor is a person who is in a destination for under 12 months. So students in Australia, up to the point they're here for 12 months, they're counted as temporary visitors. And so that comprises a decent proportion of the spend. But then what we wanted to do was recognise the spend by students when they hit 12 months and longer. And so together, that makes a very significant contribution to the international spend. Then you've got VFR, work, business and holiday. So when you think about tourism in Australia, often people go straight to international travellers, but when you look at the total scale and scope, international holiday-specific travellers in that 10 billion. And so we have then thought about that in terms of how we think about diversification and modernisation to address that change in the market, as particularly international student market has grown dramatically for our country. So the value of the visitor economy, this just shows you going back to December 18 right through to September 23. We have our target of 166 billion there. And this shows you how we got to 166 before COVID, and then things dropped back and has climbed back up and over. Now, what's really interesting here is that tourism or non-educated related travel for the year ending 2023 for data to September increased by 28%, whilst education increased by 7%. So tourism without education was still growing quite well. And it's really interesting because the number of international students in Australia, as at the 30th of November 2023, so this is what we know from visa data, was 608,600. So it's 27% more than pre-COVID. And of course, you know from discussion about migration what challenge that is having in terms of housing. So very interesting. But personal travel really kind of increased over that period as well. So we have a couple of targets. We had our interim target to get us back to pre-COVID of 166 billion for phase 1 and 70 billion for regional within that 166 by the end of 2024. And we also then had total long-term target of 230 billion by 2030. Now those targets were established when we really didn't know what to expect at the time, having to revise Thrive, if you can think about being in the middle of COVID. And so we'll talk a bit more about what we're going to do as a result of that. But what we really wanted to do, and this was a recommendation from the independent panel in the development of Thrive, was to have some longitudinal indicators for the visitor economy which go just beyond spend. So looking at a much broader set of social, environmental and governance measures so that we have a more holistic approach to what we're measuring, not just counting spend all the time as if that's the be all and end all, which of course we know is. Now, one of the things that's important with our targets is to recognise that in Thrive 2030, we are counting day trip travel, domestic day trip, as well as overnight. Now, in Tourism 2020, if you're studying things over time, in Tourism 2020, we didn't count day trip. It was only overnight. States and territories think that the day trip market is very, very important, and it's very important to be able to service and therefore measure. So it's there. And also long-term education. So students from 12 months on were not counted in the Tourism 2020. And this is also why we talk about Thrive, the reimagined visitor economy, not just tourism, because we're trying to think about those broader changes and markets. So let's have a look at this slide. This is a cracker. I love this slide. Domestic, overnight and international spend in the capital cities versus the regions for the year ending December 2019. So when you look at the total spend in the regions, in regional Australia, so that's every capital city, and I think the Gold Coast is counted as a capital city for the purpose of this data, only 10% of total spend by international travellers was spent in a region. So it's very, very kind of interesting, great opportunity there. And there's lots of reasons in terms of time and travel and the ease of move into regionals, etc. Whereas capital cities accounted for over 40% of the spend by internationals, which is no surprise because that's mainly where they come into the country and start their journey. But what does it look like when we look at the data we have, recognising that these spend estimates are still a combination of imputed and survey-based data because we're still coming back in terms of our IDS. It shows that for the year to the end of September, it's 6% for international spend within regional Australia and 30% in capital cities. So we're still adjusting and changing. But this is why we have a focus on regions when we talk about some of our opportunities into the future. So another way of showing that interim progress is to say, well, we had a $166 billion target and we hit 199 as at September 2023. So we're well and truly back. And some people will say to me, well, you know, that's inflation, right? But actually the spend is still higher than the rate of inflation when you take inflation into account. And you can see trip changes and numbers changing over time as well. So the regional component was at 80 billion or 115% of target there. So while we're thinking about these things, domestic and international economy is of course subject to instability and changes. There is discretionary impact for lots of people. I read a story on the ABC this morning about people talking about the ridiculous price of dishwasher tablets, for instance, and how, you know, what that means in terms of being on a relatively fixed or low income. And I know students, for instance, are very much in that space. So those things will impact on the ability for people to discretionarily travel for tourism and other purposes. Now, the TRA produces every year expenditure forecasts, and our forecasts are methodologically a combination of databases and information like that is put out by Oxford Economics, but we also spend time to talk to a wide range of experts about their qualitative views about what might happen in the future and what's going on, so that we can produce relatively reasonable forecasts, which of course we do every year. So they're always changing, going up and down, taking into account the things that people said and the data that was predicted and what actually therefore happened in the world. And there's lots of things happening in the world right now that's affecting the cost of fuel and people's interest in travelling, etc. So this is interesting when you kind of see the trajectory that we're on. So by 2028, we're really forecasting to get, to get into quite high numbers and approaching the 100 billion target by the end of 2028 for regions. But what I would say is that we have to be really careful and think about the prospect of there being potentially other changes or other challenges like COVID, and we really don't know how, for instance, changes in the climate and the weather is going to impact on our ability to do what we have normally done for years in the past. So we're just thinking about that and having to adjust and think more carefully about that with our forecasts into the future. But when you split the forecasts up into international and domestic visitor spend, so international is the bottom line, remembering that the lion's share of our expenditure is in domestic. And that's kind of interesting, right? Because domestically, travellers tend to fly and flop. They don't spend as much on experiences. They tend to, when I was here on Sunday night, there were a lot of clearly travellers in Woolworths and Coles buying, their food rather than going out to restaurants. So domestic travellers tend to spend as they do at home, even though they're in a different place. So lots of opportunities there, but you can see there's some shift and change in terms of the trajectory for the forecast for the different visitor type. So why is regional tourism important? Well, did you know that double the amount, tourism contributes double the amount to regional economies in terms of GDP than it does in the capital cities, even though you think about the amount of spend and activity that's happening in capital cities. 30% of all tourism businesses are based in regions. So that's quite a thing when you think about them only capturing 10% of the actual spend there's in international as well. And yet we've got very strong expenditure occurring domestically in regions. They recovered very quickly and they're very resilient and shown great resilience during the pandemic. So really, really important to the lifeblood and the culture of those towns around Australia when we think about it. Now, this slide, I'm showing to you the visitor spend in regional Australia and the capital cities. So the spend contribution or percentages in the bars. On the slide itself, the regional share is the bottom line at the start on the left, and the capital city is the top line. So you can see where the line switched over during COVID. People wanted to get out of the cities. They wanted to get away from other people and spread out a bit more and see more of our country. And you can see that huge amount of spend that occurred in regions overtaking the amount that's always spent in cap cities. And then you can see the change over time. So very, very interesting that shift, and it shows you what is possible when there are other barriers and changes put in place. So what opportunities do we have for long-term targets, recognising some of those challenges? So we grouped them into 5 areas: sustainability, workforce, accessibility, diversification, and product development. And what we wanted to do here was just do a little ad for the grants available from the Infrastructure Department called the Growing Regions Program, which is worth $600 million, and the Regional Precincts and Partnerships Program, which is worth $400 million. So a lot of work was done in the Infrastructure Department by the new government under the direction of Minister King to really think about how to best use the incredible amount of money government puts into regions. And we played a part in really making sure that tourism was part of those processes, and are really grateful for the work and the grants that are therefore available to tourism, for tourism, particularly for local governments, and the development of what you call foundational architecture or infrastructure that's really important to ensure that tourism can really grow and be well supported in those areas. So the first opportunity is around sustainability, and it's great to see the enormous work that's being done by GIFT in this area by many of your staff and students. So shout out for you in that space. And we're very excited, of course, by the consumer demand. And there's one thing to say you wanted, it's another to be able to get them to make that choice at that point of decision making. It's like everything, we have aspirations and intentions, and doesn't always translate. And we continue to say that a sustainable option doesn't necessarily mean an expensive option in lots of different ways. But we've done work with our colleagues in the states and territories around a framework and a toolkit to really build on that and recognise the certification and accreditation options and further learning that's available at the moment. So really just digging into the Thrive action, we had a specific action to have a sustainability framework and education tools. And now in November, we launched a nationally agreed national sustainable framework for the visitor economy in Australia, which was signed up to by every single tourism minister. And it means that we are all on the same page, and we have a very big vision to be a world leader in this area, which will require some effort, I think, really. And then we have a toolkit, really practical free resource to help small businesses understand what is this thing, how does it work, and how can they get going in it. And of course, the start is really hard, isn't it? So that's what it looks like. And also it was something that everyone got behind in the states and territories really quickly. And of course, Tourism Australia is an important partner in that work as well. And what we're saying here with this work is that it's not environmental again, it's much more broad. It's how you get social license, it's how you give back, it's how you get people on the path to understand the difference between sustainability and regenerative tourism, very different things, and to really be realistic as we go through that journey. So we have two versions of the toolkit, one that's downloadable with lots of guides and checklists and examples, and then we have a much simpler version through business.gov.au that you can access as well. So the second opportunity, again, another area Griffith has a lot to do with you guys and Paula Ruff's centre as well. So a lot of action by the government in this space. So we had the Job Summit last year. We had a Tourism Job Summit that led into the Job Summit, led into the Employment White Paper, migration strategy, which of course you'll be very aware of. You're doing your own work to support the understanding in the Working Holidaymaker program. We got, through a government election commitment, a grant for Accommodation Australia to run a hub to enable connections between employers and employees and training and delivery, and really made that right across the visitor economy rather than just within that, you know, that association and membership, which is fantastic. And Be Free, TAFE, and the work being done there. And of course, important to recognise industry bodies' work like Tour Guides Australia, ATEC, basically trying to build micro-credential and support micro-credentialing and support the building of skills in the workforce in those sorts of areas. We've had a measure which we've run out at Austrade to promote the government's $4,000 work bonus to encourage Australians back into the workforce, which is now a permanent measure. It was temporary and now permanent. We've had an enormous engagement with this campaign. One of the most clicked on government campaigns in Facebook, for instance. All my aunties keep telling me they were sick of seeing this from us. I'm not sure if it's true about that, as they were looking for new opportunities and are about the same, in that age. We also have worked with social services and are really happy to see a pilot to connect tourism businesses with disability employment services, because that's a system that's not really working for tourism operators very well. And there's a survey out at the moment about the broader scheme asking for feedback about how to make the employment system work better for employers to engage different sorts of workforce. So I encourage you to think about what you've learned and to participate in that survey. And then we ran some grants to give state and territories money to do their own work to create campaigns and activities, and each state's doing that, including Queensland. We also have spent quite a bit of time focusing on accessible tourism, a growing area. It's It's one where TRA has been doing some work to look at our statistics in relation to travellers with a disability, to update the data that we have, and I've got a slide to show you next. But great work being done by Queensland with its year of accessible tourism and then expanding. The states and territories funded some work which we'll be releasing as well very shortly. And again, the more firms that employ people with different sorts of abilities, the more they can better understand and more effectively cater to people with different abilities as well. So we're thinking about that. That's a picture of James work. And Cocky Guides, and that's the first group of people, vision impaired, significantly vision impaired people who are at the top of Mount Kosciuszko. So, you know, there are a lot of things you can challenge in that space. So this slide shows domestic trips in the March quarter of 2022. 20% of those trips, 13 million trips, involved at least one person with a disability or long-term health impairment, which fits into the definition of disability, but not everybody with a long-term health impairment, like for instance, type 2 diabetes would necessarily say that they have a disability. So we talk about it like that. And the spend was 16%. And we note that the spend could be higher because people often would like to stay longer or spend more, but they're often restricted by their choices and capacity to engage. And so that's quite a strong contribution. So we're putting out a report from TRA on that work very soon, and it does account, when you take that quarter data and expand it, it's a huge amount of money, and it's a huge and important market, and people with different abilities should be able to travel just as everybody else can. So it's also about equality and opportunity. Market diversification, huge opportunity in considering where we are in the world, that a lot of our markets have been very much sort of post-colonial markets, English-speaking markets, and there's things we need to do, particularly people do make significant changes around sustainability and meeting carbon net zero targets. Therefore, we need to find more markets coming from closer, or deal with those markets in terms of people staying longer when they do come from afar to manage that carbon over a period of time. So a lot of prospective growth segments here, particularly around international students and their attached VFR travel, sustainable tourism, First Nations, visiting friends and relatives, and of course we have the invested strategy with a very specific visitor economy chapter, which I think is helpful to give its work in terms of what you're doing in the Indo-Pacific as well, to build capability and to consider support. And so many of your PhD students come from that part of the world as well, really interestingly. So quite a few challenges to overcome if we are to better meet the needs of those markets. And listening to Professor Chon yesterday, improve some of their service standards to meet the expectations, particularly of the Asian markets. So this slide's my favourite. I posted this a couple of days ago on LinkedIn. It's from last week's overseas arrivals. TRA pulled that information together for me to show the recovery in the international visitor arrival markets itself. So on the left is the percentage of pre-pandemic level travel when you compare it to up to the end of November 2023. So we look at the proportion, and so where are we up to percentage-wise? So Vietnam hits the top at 134% of pre-pandemic travel, Korea at 101, India at 99. India's been going up and down, by the month. It's been persistently above 100% for a great many months, or around 100%. Philippines, Thailand, 98, 97. So right down at the bottom is China at 35%. They opened, of course, much later and have a whole range of other reasons why they're not there yet. But when you look at the visitor numbers on the right-hand side, so you can get excited by Vietnam being right at the top, but it's really important to remember the visitor numbers. So that's a proportion. Visitor numbers are at 151,502. Still a very healthy number, but hey, look at New Zealand right up there at 1.1 million travellers. Often thought of as a domestic market really, but when you see what they're doing and how frequently they're coming and how much time they spend and what they're doing differently to what they were doing before, there's clearly a segment of well-off New Zealanders coming to Australia very regularly to shop, go to concerts, theatre, sport, and they're spending. So some of our assumptions about what markets want and are and how they're spending should really be challenged, and we should follow Professor Chun's advice to be data-driven and thinking about how the world has actually changed when we think about where the opportunities lie and whether they're worth investing in or not. And that's an individual decision, of course, for different parts or players, but at a structural level, we're looking at that carefully. So China's still at 35%, is at 469,000 people. So clearly a powerhouse and a big spender in the past, and we would like it to be a bit higher. So what about shares to regional Australia? What we've done in this slide is we put the most highly visited markets at the top and grouped them. So our big numbers are at the black, our kind of medium-sized number countries in the middle, and the little countries are down the bottom, right? So we're not kind of mixing it. We're helping you get a bit of perspective. And what we're saying here in terms of visitor shares is you have a look there, a lot, 50% plus UK going to regional Australia, huge number of them going to the Northern Territory, love going to the Northern Territory, and 41% of them here for holiday, 41% for employment, BFR at 32, education at 20, and business at 17. So you kind of start thinking about, well, how could we be changing the way we think about these markets and looking at opportunities as a result of understanding a little bit more. And so I had someone say to me on my feed, well, clearly the employment number is all the backpackers. Yes, maybe, but there's also a lot of very highly professional, very well paid mining people that come out to manage and set up mines at various points, etc. They're a very different market, obviously, to a backpacker market. So worth looking at. So regionally, international education is a huge opportunity, because when you look at the share, the spend, or the share of spend has been going backwards in the region, starting at 8% in September 2012 and dropping down to 4% in September 2020. Part of that is about the increase over time by the capital city-based unis, who have been growing and growing and growing. And so the regional unis haven't necessarily grown as much because they may not be as competitive in the context of cost and comparison for what they offer to students. But there is a very big opportunity, not only in terms of where they study, but how we get them out to the regions to explore the real Australia and to have a great experience outside of their cap cities when they're not studying and enjoying themselves. So quite a chance there. And the last one is, what are they doing? Okay, so what do people do in regional areas, and how do we leverage those product development based on what they like to do? And again, here thinking about what we know versus what we think we know based on our past and our history. So, and so a couple of slides here. I just wanted to show you popular domestic overnight leisure activities by domestic visitors to regional Australia's dark bar, and visitors to capital cities. So of course, when you travel, you do it out. Look at the number there though, it's 57 to 68%. And then you get into other activities and they're quite low, right? They're in the 20s, they're in the teens. So you can see this fly and flop experience. People go out and do things, but they're not doing them to a huge degree. But let's have a look at the international visitors and how much they do. They do a lot more. This is old data because, you know, it takes a lot to pull it out, and we're still in the imputation space in some of our data sources. So we just thought we'd go back. But, you know, international travellers, they do a lot more when they're here. And if you think about Australians, when we go overseas, we tend to pack in every opportunity we can to see everything, and we tend to not do that domestically. And how do we change that mindset and take great advantage of the people who are already here, and how we can support what they do. And so nature-based activities also been growing at a huge rate from 2014. So just that kind of getting healthy and getting out and about and thinking about how to experience the world in a different way. And so thinking about product development actually growing along with the natural interests that people have had growing over time. And that even got bigger during COVID because people generally didn't want to be as much with other people in crowds. And so some of those things like national parks and beaches and those things went really high. And we know agritourism, for instance, is very, very interesting. So last, just right at the end now, festivals and events make a huge difference. They enable a smoothing. They take the peaks out. If small towns can put on events that attract people, that can make a huge difference. We put money into doing that during COVID to support small locations, bushfire affected locations, to run little festivals as trial. And even if you generate 10,000 people over a month, you're generating close to $1 million worth of economic value for a town, and in the off season makes a really big difference, and we know people love that stuff. So TRA, just reminding people about the ability to get a bunch of TRA data for free on our website, and also subscribe to and get bespoke data at lower cost if it's of interest. And we have these regional tourism satellite accounts which go into much more detail for every one of the 76 regions. We're just finalising the new ones for the last financial year, and they'll come out. So that really helps people understand. And we know when I talk to people at conferences, often I'll show them this and they'll say that they're buying this from someone with a nice fat logo on it and they could have got it for free. So I'm trying to promote it and make sure, because there's a lot of data resellers and repackagers out there, and good luck to them, but it's there for people in the Commonwealth, and the states and territories are already paying for it. So we're keen to share it. And I think we've come to the end. Thank you. So happy to take questions, and hope that's been some useful insights.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sam, and great presentation on so much data, and the slides will be available afterwards.
Yeah, just share the slides.
Yeah, absolutely. So people can grab a copy of the slides and kind of digest a lot of that and think about that in terms of their research. I know a lot of the time when we're writing grants, particularly to the Australian government, be the Australian Research Council, or we actually are putting in a grant for the Growing Regions Fund. Some of our researchers are working on that, understanding those kind of national priorities and being able to use some of that data to justify the grant application is really helpful. So thank you to you and your team.